Good morning, everybody, and good morning to the members of the media that have joined us. Thank you very much for making time for this press conference. I'm just going to quickly do a quick rundown of how we are going to work this morning. I'm going to, in a short while, introduce our panel. I have the easier job today of simply chairing this press conference, and then I will introduce our panel, briefly introduce why we're here, and then I am going to hand over to them. Just wanted to alert you, you can ask your questions, members of the media, you can ask your questions either through the chat function. Throughout the press conference, the team will help me sort of manage these questions as they come in, and you can indicate to whom the question is directed. And also I'll have an open round at the end of the inputs from the panel for you to ask your questions and any follow-ups or any questions of clarity. This morning, the Democratic Alliance is announcing the introduction of two separate bills, which will be introduced as private members' bills in Parliament in the coming while. And the intention behind these bills, and Glynnis and Natasha and Advocate Paul Hoffman will explain to you exactly how the mechanics of this will work. But broadly speaking, the intention of the introduction of these bills is to give rise or to establish an anti-corruption commission, which will be a Chapter 9 institution, and they will explain to you why there is a gap currently with the institutions that we have, which are not able to investigate corruption cases in the way that we need them to. So with me today, I've got Natasha Mazzone, who's the Chief Whip of the Democratic Alliance in Parliament. We've got Advocate Glynnis Breytenbach, who is the Shadow Minister in the Justice Portfolio Committee. And we've got Advocate Paul Hoffman, who is leading the team from Accountability Now. And we've got Margie Duplessis, who's also the team from Accountability Now. So Natasha, I'm going to hand over to you. If you can give us an introduction, then Glynnis we won't necessarily stop in between speakers. Glynnis will follow, and then Paul will take us home, and then we can ask some questions. Thank you very much. Over to you, Natasha.
Thank you, Siv. Good morning, colleagues. Special thank you to Accountability Now for being with us today, and good morning to my colleague Glynnis too. The DA is extremely proud and excited to announce that we will be submitting two bills to Parliament, which will effectively establish a new Chapter 9 institution if accepted by the committee. Chapter 9 institutions play a very special role in South Africa's oversight mechanism. They are a sacrosanct institution that we have in South Africa, and that's why they are known as the untouchable institutions, and they must be beyond reproach. The Zondo Commission has shown us beyond reasonable doubt that we have an absolute need in our country to establish some form of corruption fighting mechanism, because it is very clear that the institutions that we have at hand at the moment do not have the ability to fight corruption. And certainly our country has been ravaged by corruption in the last while, as indicated, and as plays out like a very bad soap opera through the Zondo Commission and through PPE scandals, but to name but a few. This is an unprecedented and momentous occasion, both for the DA, for Accountability Now, and for Parliament, as it's a long overdue step in making sure that we give effect to things like the Glynnis judgment and bolstering the independence of high-level corruption-fighting institutions in the Republic of South Africa. Advocate Paul Hoffman, will explain the significance of the Glynnis case and why the government is bound to take effective measures to fight corruption. We know, and we have seen in recent times, the way corruption demoralizes our society. It delegitimizes what politicians and the role of politics is all about. It makes state-owned entities easy cannon fodder for those who are looking to be corrupt. And it also shows, it creates an empathy in our country towards being politically involved, because it would seem that those who are most involved in corruption get off scot-free or have a very light pat on the hand if and when they are caught. We have seen, and we continue to see, as we are seeing today and as we will see in the rollout next week, unfortunately, that the ANC is less than enthusiastic to combat and certainly to prosecute high-level corruption cases, and do their level best, no matter how many times someone says that they look forward to their day in court. The ANC is not enthusiastic about prosecuting these cases. This highlights the truly absolute need that we have in South Africa at the moment for a Chapter 9 institution that will prioritize the prosecution of corruption cases in South Africa. And it will also, in our opinion, relieve the capacity that constrains the NPA in doing just that, which is combating corruption cases. The COVID-19 pandemic, without a doubt, showed wide-scale corruption, state capture under the ANC government, and now the shocking rioting and looting in KZN have placed an immense burden on the NPA's investigative capacities. It has become clear that they now are in absolute need of help, and that is our intention. Our intention here is not to put ideologies in place of what we should be doing, which is doing the work of the People's Parliament. We are here today to come together as South Africans and say, let's put these ideologies aside, come together and come up with a solution. And we believe that the solution is the introduction of these laws that will create a new Chapter 9 institution. We intend to submit these private members' bills, which will be called the Anti-Corruption Commission once the Chapter 9 institution is created. The Hawks are currently housed in SAPS and are indirectly accountable to government itself, whereas a Chapter 9 institution would not be, and it would have a larger scope and a larger ability to act within the interests of South Africans, and certainly not within the interests of the government. It is clear that our government has failed in this respect. The Constitutional Court found that the current body, the Director of Priority Crime Investigation, Hawks, is not sufficiently independent. And that is one of the problems that we face today in our corruption battles, and it is a problem that we seek to overcome. So as a result, and through the tremendous efforts and tremendous work of accountability now, the DA intends to do what the ANC has failed at doing, and that is to create a body that absolutely looks at corruption and has no fear or favour in combating and prosecuting corruption. The DA is proud to be taking this historic step today, and we are thankful to all those who have assisted and worked endless hours in putting these ideas and these structures together. We hope that civil societies and parties across the board spectrum will support us in this increasingly and absolutely urgently important endeavour.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and over to you, Glynnis.
Hi, thanks, sir. Thank you, and good morning to everybody. These suite of bills is important in the South African context. There have been no major corruption cases prosecuted in South Africa in the past decade. Not only is this completely unsatisfactory and has led to an enormous backlog of cases that really should have been prosecuted, this has also resulted in a lack of experience building within the NPA, and this is again showing now. This was inter alia revealed during feedback given by the NPA's investigating directorate at Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Accounts earlier this month. Of course, over the Zuma years, the NPA was also hollowed out significantly, as was the as was the South African police. Of course, because they threatened Zuma directly and his cohorts. Currently, there are significant capacity constraints within the NPA. The head of the Hawks, General Godfrey Lebeya, said earlier this week that the unit is operating at a 47% capacity and requires almost 3,000 more staff to reach a full staff complement. The type of crimes that we're talking about here almost exclusively are investigated by the Hawks, and they simply are not managing. They have a backlog of almost 76,000 dockets, most of which are fraud, corruption, and money laundering and other serious offences. So the history of this bill is long and dates back to around 2011 and came about as a result of the Glynnis judgments, which Paul will deal with in more detail. The establishment of the DPCI, the Hawks, was done to replace the disbanded Directorate of Special Operations, or the Scorpions as they were known. The Scorpions were disbanded, of course, controversially because they were independent, because they were effective, and because they did their job without fear, favour, or prejudice, and sent politically well-connected people, inter alia, to jail. This did not earn them any favour with the governing party, and as a result, they were disbanded. This was opposed by many South Africans, including the Democratic Alliance at the time, and has left us largely in the position in which we find ourselves now, that there is no real capacity to investigate serious corruption. The capacity is limited and overstretched. And within the National Prosecuting Authority, there is no huge capacity to investigate the volume of cases that currently exist. So there's a huge lacuna there, there's a vacuum that needs desperately to be filled. And we're hoping that the introduction of these bills and eventually the passing of these bills will fill that vacuum and fill the space. We can talk a little bit about the composition of the proposed composition of the Anti-Corruption Commission, perhaps at question time. Natasha's already dealt with why it should be a Chapter 9 institution. And I must acknowledge that a lot of the work done on these bills was initially done by Accountability Now, by Paul Hoffman and his staff, and that we have leaned heavily and borrowed liberally from their work, for which we thank them. And we intend to cooperate with them going forward. I must also stress that all of these proposals that we make today will be thrashed out very thoroughly with both the police and with the National Prosecuting Authority. We're not suggesting that we replace the NPA. We're not trying to usurp their powers. We're not trying to operate in opposition or competition with them. We're trying to find a way of streamlining the investigation and prosecution of serious grand-scale corruption that lightens the burden on the NPA, and whatever is done with regards to this legislation and possibly the commission, if it is formed, will always be done in collaboration with and cooperation with the National Director of Public Prosecutions and the Commissioner of the South African Police. This is not a structure that can operate in any other way. So I hand over to Paul.
Thanks, Glynnis.
Thank you, Glynnis, and thank you also to the DA for the opportunity of giving this platform to Accountability Now. If I've understood the speakers ahead of me, the intention is to start with a private member's bill, both for the constitutional amendment that is required and for the enabling legislation for the new anti-corruption body. And that if it is possible along the way, the DA will seek to turn the private member's bill into a committee bill. And that will be a question of negotiation between political parties represented in Parliament. The history of accountability now in relation to this project is a long and complex one, which I don't think we need to dwell on for too long here today. As indicated by Glynnis, the trouble started when the Scorpions were closed down and then replaced by the Hawks, who do not have the capacity, the structural and operational independence to be able to deal with serious corruption as it manifests in South Africa. When Accountability Now had the opportunity of making representations to the Joint Parliamentary Committee that was given the task of creating efficient and effective, adequately independent anti-corruption machinery after the Hawks had been declared unconstitutional for want of compliance with the criteria that were set by the Constitutional Court during the majority judgment penned by Deputy Chief Justice Moseneke and Justice Cameron and delivered in March 2011. Accountability Now decided to prepare what were then thought to be the appropriate amendments to the Constitution and the enabling legislation for a body to replace the Hawks. At that stage, it was thought that the National Prosecuting Authority, which is enjoined by the Constitution to act without fear, favour, or prejudice, would have sufficient capacity to attend to the prosecutorial functions around dealing with the corrupt, while the Anti-Corruption Commission would really be doing the investigative work that had been allocated to the Hawks, but which the court had found was not enough. Instead of accepting that proposal back in 2012, when the period given to amend the legislation expired, Parliament decided, and it was only the ANC that so decided, to tweak the Hawks legislation as little as possible, and that led to further litigation and the further tweaking of the Hawks legislation by the court itself. That leaves us with Hawks in their third generation, and at this stage there's no political party in Parliament who thinks that the Hawks are up to the task of investigating grand corruption, kleptocracy, and the state capture phenomenon that has overtaken South Africa during the Zuma years. Now, obviously, if accountability is to be exercised and exacted in South Africa, we will need to have anti-corruption machinery of state that is up to the task. Accountability Now's current position is different to what it was in 2012 when we first put the drafts on the table. We've moved away from the idea of an anti-corruption commission. We believe that it would be a more positive approach to call the institution the Integrity Commission, because that is really what the work of the corruption busters in it will do. We've also concluded that because the National Prosecuting Authority has been weakened, hollowed out is the expression that its leadership uses, and because it is infested with saboteurs, we have a situation in which the National Prosecuting Authority is not up to the task at hand, and the anti-corruption prosecutions should be handled by the Integrity Commission, which we have in mind. Now, we've taken the idea of the introduction of an independent body of corruption busters to Parliament in the past. Vincent Smith was the chairman of the Constitutional Review Committee in 2016, when we presented our ideas around this to that committee, and our intention on a different tack to that which the DA can take, because the DA is in a position to introduce private members' bills. What we will do in the course of the next couple of months is produce a draft constitutional amendment and a draft enabling legislation for a body that is able to investigate and to prosecute grand corruption. And we will present that to the Constitutional Review Committee, probably before the parliamentary drafters are able to produce the bills that the DA has in mind. Obviously, there will be overlap and there will be collaboration, but our independent effort is designed to move the process forward faster than has hitherto been the case. We know that the Inkatha Freedom Party is in favor of an integrity commission, and the president, when asked why not do it at question time in March 2019, said that it was a refreshing idea to have such a body and that he would mull over it. In August last year, the National Executive Committee of the ANC, which is its highest policy-making body between conferences, passed a resolution instructing Cabinet urgently to put in place a permanent, standalone, independent entity that could deal with corruption. Nothing further has been heard about that, and some people don't even think that it was a seriously intended resolution. But we do know that in February this year, at the SONA address at the opening of Parliament, the President did indicate that a body is being considered that will report to Parliament rather than to the executive, which is a step in the right direction, and that his intention is to appoint an advisory council on this amendment of the law to create the body that reports to Parliament rather than to the executive. With all of the Chapter 9 institutions do that already. So it looks as if 3 of the 4 biggest parties in Parliament are moving in the direction of reforming the criminal justice administration so as to better enable the state to counter the corrupt in our midst. This has to be a good thing for South Africa. It has to be a good thing for the rule of law. And the sooner it is done, the better. We all know that too many people within the governing alliance will be the victims of such a body, and that this seems, as Natasha suggested in her introductory remarks, this seems to be the reason why there is so much foot dragging in the corridors of power when it comes to addressing the need for proper anti-corruption machinery of state, which is able to enforce the very good laws that Parliament has passed in relation to the prevention and combating of corrupt activities. The modus operandi of accountability now at this stage is to applaud the efforts of the DA to get its private members' bill shipshape and ready for Parliament as soon as possible. And in parallel with that, we will put our own version of what we believe fits the bill at this stage before the Constitutional Review Committee of Parliament. That is a standing committee of the National Assembly as soon as we can. I think I've been a little bit greedy with the time, but I'm very happy to answer questions if there are any. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to work through the questions. I think Azola and the team, there's a couple of questions which I think are quite important. So I'm going to pose it both to Glynnis and Paul. The issue around, it's coming up quite a bit. So Jan Gerber, News 24, asking, would it not be more suitable to strengthen the NPA, particularly the investigative directorate, than establishing a new entity? And then Anton from Pretoria FM has asked a similar question about whether or not it's better not to address the understaffing at Hawks and NPA. Is this anti-corruption commission not just a band-aid that you want to stick on a bigger understaffing and underfunding issue? And it's also kind of related to the question that Jan had around the fact that the Hawks, NPA, SIU, and the public protector were all under severe budgetary pressure. It appears that corruption busters are not a priority when the budgets are drawn up. How will this new Chapter 9 body be funded? Is there legislative provision to ensure that it receives sufficient funding? So I've grouped those because I think they're quite interrelated. Glynnis, do you want to take a stab, and then I'll move to Paul, and then there are some other questions, but I thought it's just better to group them according to their themes. Glynnis, over to you.
So, yeah, sure. So yeah, I see the questions. The problem is that certainly the Hawks and the NPA are under-resourced, both with human resources and they have financial constraints. That's true. The problem with the investigating directorate, which was meant to fill this gap for a brief period of time, 5 years, the lifespan is 5 years, and we're nearly 3 years down the line of that 5 years, and they have yet to get anyone into court. So they're investigating away, and I've got no doubt that they're doing their best with what they have. The fact of the matter is, by the time they get ready to go to court, their lifespan will be over. And those cases will then, of necessity, get dumped on the normal, already existing structures of the NPA, which are wholly unable to deal with them, not capacitated either with experience, with human resources, or with money. So the investigating directorate is not the answer, and it never has been. So it's better to set up, and of course it is dependent on the Hawks to investigate, which is a problem. The Hawks are not politically independent, and as we can see, there are serious constraints within the Hawks. So it's, in our view, better to take the pain now, go through the difficulties of setting up a Chapter 9 institution. I don't for one moment think it will be easy, it won't. Setting up a Chapter 9 institution, getting it off the ground and up and running while, you know, Glynnis is still relatively fresh in our minds, and while we still have expertise in and around the police and the NPA that can assist with this process. A lot of people are retiring, a lot of people are leaving those two organizations as a result of natural attrition. And so while that experience, even if it isn't while it may not necessarily be those exact people being taken up into such a Chapter 9 body, their experience, their views, their abilities can be harnessed to make this anti-corruption commission something worthwhile. So I don't believe that simply bolstering the resources, financial and otherwise, of the Hawks and the NPA or the investigating directorate is the answer, because that is all short-lived. An anti-corruption commission that we envisage will be an independent, standalone Chapter 9 institution that has the independence of the Office of the Public Protector, that answers only to the courts, that there can be no political interference legitimately exercised over it, and that we then fund the money, and I understand the difficulties of resourcing and funding, and I know that the police are severely under-resourced and the NPA is equally severely under-resourced. But that being said, if we're successful in setting up an institution that can demonstrably, successfully investigate and prosecute large-scale corruption on a grand scale, that works and that puts those responsible behind bars, and that's tangible consequences for poor behavior, I've got no doubt that funding is available, and that there will be funding available extraneously from the Treasury also for this type of institution. So funding is something that is always a worry, and this is no exception. I've got no doubt that we'll be able to find the money to make this work, as long as it is demonstrably an institution that should be successful and that is 100% independent, that people can have faith in. I think the funding will follow. And so for those reasons, I think this anti-corruption commission will be more effective than housing it within the NPA and being dependent solely on the Hawks. Thank you.
Thanks, Glynnis. Paul, can you come in here?
Yes.
And perhaps if you can just also add whether, so Anton had asked whether or not this commission will have prosecutorial powers, or its investigations will be referred to the NPA ultimately. If so, if you can just address that as well.
Yes, I think that the starting point to answer these questions is to look at the criteria that was set in binding terms by the highest court in the land in the Glenister 2 decision of March 2011. That court said that corruption is a human rights issue because if you allow corruption to run its course, you cannot deliver on the human rights obligations of the state. Those obligations are that the state must respect, protect, promote, and fulfill all of the rights in the Bill of Rights. And a lot of those rights, especially the socio-economic ones, are very expensive to deliver. It also found that the international obligations of South Africa under the UN Convention Against Corruption oblige South Africa to have effective and efficient anti-corruption machinery of state. It's very clear that we don't have that at the moment. So we are in breach of our international obligations, and we are in breach of our obligation to respect and protect the rights guaranteed to everybody in the Bill of Rights. Now, the idea of a single entity to combat the corrupt comes from the Glenister 3 judgment, where the Chief Justice, the current Chief Justice, indicated that an entity is required, not a collection of entities. If you are going to deal on a specialized basis with properly trained personnel who are structurally and operationally independent and properly resourced and secure in their tenure of office, that's what's called the STIRS criteria: specialized, trained, independent, resourced, and secure. If you're going to do that, you're going to have to break away from the idea of the Hawks who do priority crimes, among them corruption, and the National Prosecuting Authority, which has the task of prosecuting all crime in South Africa, including corrupt activities. The specialist body, if it functions as it should, will be able to rake back the loot of state capture. Now, the estimates of that loot amount to 1.5 trillion rands on some counts Others say it's about R1 trillion that has been sucked out of the system by those who sought to capture the state or engaged in kleptocracy during the presidency of Jacob Zuma. Raking back that money is going to enable the anti-corruption machinery of state to not only fund itself properly, but to return money to Treasury, because there is a great deal of low-hanging fruit waiting out there. There are banks as well as kleptocrats who need to be sued in order to account for their participation in state capture. So I have no difficulty with the notion that if the loud and clear message, the STIRS message of Glynnis 2 and the single entity message of Glynnis 3 is brought onto the statute book by this Parliament, that the best way to do it is to create this new Chapter 9 institution that deals with serious corruption.
Thank you, Paul. Glynnis, I would like you to please answer Lula Ma's question asking when are you submitting the 2 bills? It's linked to somewhat Zinhle's other question, if you could also handle that. Would this corruption commission not undermine the existing justice structure like the NPA and the Hawks? I think you can deal with that. And will this not lead to tensions with these entities? Then if you can perhaps just highlight, Glynnis, the process that you would be following with the 2 bills. And Natasha, after that, if you can just talk to the issue, Zinhle is talking about, you know, you need numbers in Parliament. How will you deal with the situation where numbers are needed? You know, will you be able to be successful? So Glynnis, if you can handle those. Sorry, I'm jumping around because I'm trying to group the questions. Do you want me to run them through again?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
So the bills have been drafted in a very basic form. They're with the parliamentary legal services now, because that is the process that gets followed. We don't draft them and submit them. Parliamentary legal services, in fact, draft them so that they meet the requirements of content and format. We're in constant talks with them. They've been exceptionally helpful, I must say. They've done a great job, and they're constantly in contact with me, asking for information, direction. So they're working very hard on it. Time is of the essence, and the bills will be submitted as soon as they're ready. I can't say today, tomorrow, or next week. I can only say that everybody is very committed to this process. We work on it on a weekly basis. We're in contact, and I must commend the Parliamentary Legal Services for the hard work that they are putting into it. So they will be submitted as soon as it's possible to do so. This is not intended to undermine any of the structures that already exist in the country in the criminal justice system. Of course, there's a lot of potential for tension, and I see that. But as soon as the bills are at a point where they can be sensibly discussed with the NPA and the police, of course, we'll discuss it with them as well. It's essential to get their buy-in. And it must be made very clear that we don't intend to run a parallel system or run a system that's in competition with them. It's a Chapter 9 institution meant to support democracy. It's an additional resource for the criminal justice system. It can only be to everyone's benefit, theirs included. As long as we're very careful not to tread on toes, as long as we're very careful to consult and collaborate where essential, and of course to understand that there is only one prosecuting authority in South Africa. They have the sole right to prosecute, and nobody can usurp that power. And so whatever is done must and will always be done with consultation with the National Director of Public Prosecutions, as it's her purview. So I think if the process is managed sensibly and carefully and correctly, then there can be no possible reason for any tension, and there's certainly the criminal justice system in South Africa is in such trouble that we cannot possibly do anything to undermine it. This is meant to support it, complement it, bolster it, and make it more effective. The process is a long one. As Paul has already intimated, matters have to go to the Constitutional Review Committee. We have to get their buy-in, their approval. That has to be presented. The bills have got a long road to travel in many iterations before they can become anything like documents for public comment and consumption. So the process is a very long and quite difficult process, but it's managed in large by the Parliamentary Legal Services, and we're in their hands. But I must again stress that they have put a lot of time and effort into these pieces of legislation that we have suggested, and they really are working very hard on it. So while it's a long and intricate process, there's certainly light at the end of the tunnel, and I expect the bills to they're certainly not on the never never system. They're working hard on it, and they will be completed. Yeah.
Thank you, Glynnis. I think Natasha, if you can just perhaps just talk around numbers in Parliament and how that would affect the passing of bills and why this is still important regardless.
Right, so thanks, Siv. Once the bill is in its draft format, it becomes gazetted, and it becomes known as a ATC, which is formally tabled before Parliament. It's then open for a period of public participation. It then comes back to the committee, and the committee debates the desirability of the bill, and if it's deemed to be desirable, which of course a bill of this nature, it would be almost unbelievable to believe it would ever be deemed to be undesirable, would then go back to committee and then would be dealt with paragraph by paragraph as it goes through the committee. It would then be brought to Parliament. Parliament would then vote on the bill, and it would be a normal bills procedure. At that particular point, it would then go to the NCOP for approval in the NCOP, at which point, if the bills were accepted, it would then set into motion the necessity for a constitutional amendment, and the constitutional amendment would then have to take place. The constitutional amendment, it doesn't happen with a normal majority in Parliament. It happens with a 75% change vote in Parliament, and that's why it is so difficult to amend the Constitution. But one would also hasten to add that if our country is in fact serious about combating corruption, and if the President is in fact true to his word, as he has mentioned in the last 3 SONAs that corruption is his top priority, one would see no reason why a constitutional amendment to this effect would not be passed in the House. So those are the processes that would be followed with this particular bill, and how to bring around the constitutional change to make a new Chapter 9 institution.
All right. I think I've covered everybody's questions. Paul, do you want to have any parting shots?
Yes, I think as I understand the provisions of Section 74 of the Constitution, a 2/3 majority will get you home on an amendment to Chapter 9, and the 75% majority is one that relates to the foundational values in Chapter 1 of the Constitution. Now, I'm not entirely sure that 75% is the cutoff point. I believe you can get this particular combination of bills through with a 2/3 vote. Otherwise, I think the points have been covered. There's just one thing. People remember the tension between the Scorpions and the South African Police Service when Jackie Salebi was the head of the police. And there was an accusation that the Scorpions tended to cherry pick the cases that they would do so that they would look good and the police would be left with all of the insoluble cases and bad statistics as a result of it. What needs to happen with the introduction of this Chapter 9 institution is that very clear lines need to be drawn between those crimes that are for the commission and those that remain with the police and the NPA. That way, the treading on toes and the tensions can be brought to a minimum.
Cool, thank you so much. The last two questions, Zinhle is asking which committee Natasha is referring to. In my understanding, the committee that she's referring to is the one that will be discussing the bills, which is the Justice Committee. Am I correct, Glynnis? Yes, I am. But also Accountability Now will be petitioning the Constitutional Review Committee simultaneously as well. So those are the two committees which will be dealing with this matter on two different elements of it. And then the other question that was asked by Anton is last one is, will this commission focus on public sector corruption or just corruption in general? Anyone want to have last bites at the cherry?
All large-scale corruption. All large-scale corruption.
All right.
Yes, I think that Parliament is going to have to decide a cutoff point in terms of rands and cents as to where large-scale corruption arises. And I think there are rules already that talk about 10 million rand as being the cutoff. Maybe 5 would be a better one, but that is for Parliament to decide. It's a policy question about where do you draw the line between petty corruption, which the police and the NPA can deal with, and grand corruption, which is better dealt with by a specialist body that is compliant with the criteria that have been laid down loud and clear by the Constitutional Court in Glynnis 2.
All right. Thank you so very much, everybody. A statement will be released, which will have both Glynnis's contact details and Paul's contact details, should you need to ask any further technical questions. And thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to the people at home for streaming live with us. And we appreciate your time. Thank you very much, everybody.